One of the biggest mistakes that medical professionals make when trying to figure out their investing plans is having no idea the big number that they need to achieve on the back end to say, I am totally financially independent. Now, let's start with explaining what financial independence even means. It sounds like some pie in the sky, pot of gold at the end of the rainbow situation, but it's just a mathematical destination where your assets can pay for your lifestyle indefinitely until you die. A little bit morbid, right? But that's all it is. That can be achieved a bunch of different ways. You could do that by creating a huge portfolio of long-term rentals and have dozens and dozens of properties. You could do that with several short-term rentals with higher cash flow, or you could do the entire thing with a stock bond portfolio. For today, we're going to talk about what it looks like to create financial independence with a stock bond portfolio. This is where most medical professionals start because, frankly, it's a lot easier. You do not have to understand how to calculate a cash-on-cash return or analyze the merits of an investment when you're going to open up a Roth IRA and buy the S&P 500 or a total U.S. stock index fund. The knowledge barrier to entry is less and the financial barrier to entry is less because you can start with $20, where going out and buying a short-term rental or investing in an LP position in a multifamily syndication may require $100,000. So because this is super easy, super simple, anyone can do it starting today. This is where almost all medical professionals should start their asset building journey. Now, we all will achieve financial independence. The only difference is some of us might do it when we're 45 and some of us might do it when we're 75, right? I think most of us hope to be in the group of folks who are not working full-time all the way up until 65 or 67. But in order to do anything better than that, you have to first achieve that. So let's walk through the math behind retirement. What does that mean? Retirement, it just means you transitioning out of full-time work at some point in the future. For today, we'll talk about mid-60s. And being able to maintain your same standard of living. We're not talking about like retiring from medicine and buying a business private jet and traveling around the world. Like, we're talking about you retiring and you just having the same life. Same vacations, same restaurants, same gifts for family members, just being able to afford the same stuff. And not being the person who is really struggling, living on a fixed income, and having a hard time meeting basic needs, let alone meeting medical needs and hopefully having a little bit of fun, right? I think as clinicians, we have all seen the very genuine reality of what it looks like to be Social Security dependent. We all have patients in that category, maybe unless you're in pediatrics, but outside of that, we see that. We know what that looks like. We know how hard it can be to make ends meet, to afford the rising costs of healthcare. And yet, for some reason, all of us have this impression that that will never be us. But unless you follow the math we're going to talk about today, it may well be you. Now, this math is going to ignore Social Security. Why do I do that? I personally think it's highly unlikely that Social Security will not exist in any form when I go to retire. However, I do not have a magic 8-ball, and we all are well aware that Social Security is poorly funded, and they're already projecting they'll be unable to maintain projected outputs in just a few years. And so because I do not know what Social Security will look like in 30 years when I go to live off of assets, I don't personally choose a number and say, this is what I'm anticipating from Social Security and reduce my investing plans accordingly. Now, if I were 58 right now, I might do that, because the likelihood of Social Security looking massively different is a little bit less, right? 30 years of who knows what the heck will happen politically feels different than less than a decade. So because I'm in my 30s, and maybe you are in your 20s or 30s or 40s, I think it's wisest to prepare without Social Security. And then if it's present in any form, you will be better positioned than you even thought you would be. Now, the first premise when you're doing the math is to talk about replacing lifestyle. We can do that in two ways. The simplest is to look at replacing a percent of gross income. The probably more accurate, but riddled with problems, is to replace current expenses. Let's do income first. Most financial industry experts will say, hey, you likely need to replace 70 to 80% of your current income. I will give you a really simple mathematical example of what that could look like for a PA/NP pharmacist. First off, we're replacing 70% of income. Why? Because we want to replace our lifestyle, our purchasing power. So if you're 35, 70% of your income right now buys you a certain life, right? House, car, groceries, whatever. It buys you a lifestyle. What happens when inflation erodes that purchasing power every single year for the next 30 years? Because again, I'm mid-30s, right? When you fail to account for the inflation that will occur between now and the year you go to retire, you make one of the most common money mistakes there is. Now, most distribution strategies, when you look at living off assets, they do account for inflation in the distribution years. And so when you look at what happens when I start drawing off of my portfolio when I am in my 50s or 60s or 70s, those systems, those plans, they account for inflation. What you need to account for is inflation between now and the year that you start living off of assets. Here's the math. We will assume you make $150,000 a year and you're going to replace 70% of that income. That means you need to replace $105,000 a year. We'll assume you're 35, okay? So you have 30 years of inflation between now and 65. We will say that's a 2.5% annual inflation rate. Could that be low? Yeah, right? If you've been alive the last decade, you know we've seen periods where inflation is much higher, but we'll be conservative and we'll say 2.5% annual inflation rate. So you can use online calculators for this. I use Smart Asset a lot. It's a free online tool. It'll do the math for you, but I'll give you the cheat answer now. $105,000 right now, remember that's 70% of our income, inflation adjusted at a 2.5% inflation rate every year for the next 30 years ends up at $220,000 in future you, soon to be retired you, for you to replace your same lifestyle as right now. So now we go, okay, I was replacing 70% of my current income. When I accounted for inflation, now I've arrived at this big number of I need to replace $220,000 a year. How do I do that? Well, in very simple terms, you would use something called a withdrawal rate to determine what big portfolio number do I need to hit so that I can pull off $220,000 a year every year from retirement until death and not run out of money. Because that's the goal, right? Don't run out of money. This has been looked at a multitude of different times, a multitude of different ways. But probably the most well-known study that looked at this was the Trinity Study. This was a study that looked at long periods of historical stock market returns and said, okay, based upon different portfolio asset allocations, like different percentages of stock bond mixes, and the traditional retirement term of 30 years, what is the likelihood of success by varying withdrawal rates? Success, again, defined as not running out of money before we die. Very important. It turns out that what's classically considered safe is a 4% withdrawal rate. That means you can take your portfolio, you can withdraw 4% per year, every year, and your money will continue on until you die without you running out of funds. Now that is a vast oversimplification of how distribution works and is a very, very, very general rule of thumb that may not be applicable across the board. But it will create easy math for us so that you can start to have a genuine target number to head in the direction of. So if we assume we have that 4% withdrawal rate, right, we can rearrange the equation. If we said total portfolio balance times 0.04 or 4% equals the $220,000 we need, we can just rearrange that math and say, okay, $220,000 that we need times 25. That's going to give us our big goal. And it turns out in this sample scenario, that big goal is $5.5 million. You see how we got there? $150,000 salary, replacing 70% of that income, of inflation adjusting it from now over the next 30 years at a 2.5% annual inflation rate, and then assuming, because we're going to be a standard retiree, that we are going to multiply by 25, use a, quote, safe withdrawal rate of 4%. There we go. That's our big number, $5.5 million. Now that's across all accounts. That includes your 401k, your Roth IRA, your invested HSA, your taxable brokerage account, the whole 9 yards. That's across everything. But that's the big number. So if you look at that and you go, wow, when I plug my current investing plan into a compound interest calculator, it arrives nowhere near 5.5 million. Cool. I'm glad we figured that out. Let's make some adjustments right now, today, this week, to make sure that that's no longer the case. Now this breaks down when you look at an early retiree. Again, that data was based on a traditional retirement term of 30 years. Vanguard actually has some very interesting data on what it could look like to extend that retirement time frame up to even 50 years for the early retiree or the classic, quote, FIRE community. It turns out there's a lot more complexity in what withdrawal rate is safe in that time window. Things like whether or not you have global diversification in your portfolio, what type of spending model you use in retirement. That really dramatically changes the number, whether it's 4%, 3%, 3.5%. It is very much entwined to those portfolio-based variables. The other really important piece is when you're looking at whether it's the Trinity Study or even the information Vanguard has put out for early retirees, this is all based upon very, very low investing fees. So if you have average expense ratios of 0.04%, and you're in a lot of the zero fidelity series where you're paying zero expense ratios, you're in low cost funds at Vanguard, Charles Schwab, you're not paying an assets under management fee, all of these numbers are probably true for you. If you're someone that's paying 100 basis points on your actively managed mutual funds, and you have stacked an assets under management fee from a financial advisor on top of that, this math no longer maths. And as a matter of fact, when you looked at the early retiree portfolio, having high investment fees basically trashed the likelihood of success in Vanguard's analysis. So as you're running these numbers for yourself and you're creating a future where you're like, I'm on track for this, I've got this, you have to make sure that you know, just like medicine, right? Like what were the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the study? If they're assuming that everyone in this study that succeeds has very, very low investment fees, and I don't have low investment fees, then I probably cannot extrapolate the results to myself, right? It is literally no different than the way that we would evaluate a clinical trial. So think about that, look at your own investment fees, and reflect on whether or not this math even works for you. Now, I personally think the more accurate way to project out the math for financial independence or retirement metrics is to actually inflation adjust your expenses. But I have seen this backfire many, many times, and so I present that to you with a lot of caveats. Technically, it is slightly more accurate to use your expenses. It automatically removes taxes from the equation. It removes anything that you're investing from the equation or saving. And so it is a little bit more accurate in terms of a reflection of your lifestyle. But I have seen it backfire really tremendously in two specific situations. One, if you are someone who has really not been saving or investing, maybe you've been in practice a few years and you've been putting like 4% into your 401k, and maybe you make some Roth IRA contributions, but it's nothing substantial. You're just trying to figure this stuff out and really get yourself on track. If you look at your expenses, they will be a very high percent of your take-home pay, right? Of course, because if you haven't been saving and investing a ton, you've likely been spending your income. Well, if you look at those expenses and you inflation adjust them, your number at the end, your goal number, it becomes massive. And it doesn't even make sense because in order for you to start investing what you would need to invest, you cannot continue those current expenses anyways. You would have to find some areas to make some cuts in order to make room for investing. And so when you take someone who's spending 90% of their take-home pay or 95% of their take-home pay, and you inflation adjust those metrics, you get these huge, seemingly impossible numbers. And then when you go back and go, okay, well, how much do I even need to invest right now? It feels impossible. But mathematically, there's a lot of errors in there because those expenses will need to shift. And so in those circumstances, I really do find it is most helpful to go by percent of income, at least at first, until you have built investing systems. You're investing a consistent amount of your income on a monthly or annual basis. And then you can maybe dial back and say, okay, let me look at what are my real expenses now, and what does replacing my current inflation-adjusted expenses look like, and maybe generate a little bit more of an accurate picture. I have also seen replacing annual expenses backfire in the population of the brand new graduate. A lot of folks come out of the gate and they're in the habit of kind of living off nothing, right? Because we're all in school, we don't have any money. So then they graduate and they still aren't spending a ton, right? Maybe they're renting and they have a roommate. They're still driving the paid off used car from school. They haven't upgraded. And so their lifestyle is actually pretty inexpensive. However, it's not reasonable to think that that's going to continue on indefinitely. There's a big difference between the single new grad with a roommate and potentially, right, like the 10-year version later of you that has a spouse and a mortgage and 2 car payments and 4 kids. And you can see how inflation adjusting those little baby expenses doesn't really make a lot of sense, because those expenses aren't necessarily reflective of what you're actually going to have for the bulk of your adult life. So if you're in either of those two camps, either you've been spending a large percent of your take-home pay and that's what you've been used to, or you're relatively new professionally, you have low expenses, kudos to you, frankly, but it's not really super reflective of your future life. In both of those instances, you might be more prudent to look at replacing a percent of your gross income, and then after a few years, reassessing and looking at expenses. Now, some expenses can, of course, fall off, like childcare, right? We hope that we're not paying childcare expenses in retirement. I laugh, but it's possible that does happen to folks. Childcare is a huge expense for people with kids, and so it is nice to be able to pull something out like that, or even pull out a student loan payment, and then look at your expenses after those things. The word of caution I would give you is don't nickel and dime yourself on this. We've worked with people who they say hey, I'm going to go ahead and pull out my childcare, my student loan payment. I'm not going to have a car payment. I'm not going to have this. And they just start ripping stuff out of their monthly budget and going, I'm not going to replace this. I'm not going to replace this. I'm not going to replace this. Okay, that is true. We hope you don't have childcare, right? We hope you don't have a car payment. We hope you have a paid off car. All those things are true. But let's not negate the fact that you will have additional expenses that will come in those decades that you do not have now. For example, the most recent data I have seen is that the healthy, single, 67-year-old person with no chronic medical conditions can anticipate over $170,000 in medical expense during retirement. My suspicion is you don't spend that much on your healthcare right now, unless you are someone that has a chronic illness or has someone in your home with a chronic illness. That's a huge change in expense. In addition, the projection for needing assistance, right, classically in the form of long-term care, present to you an astronomical expense. Astronomical. You can use websites that will actually tell you the daily price right now in your zip code of home health care, of nursing home care, of memory care, and then they'll inflation adjust that out to your future retirement, and you can see that you're looking at least $100,000 a year expense, and in some cases $200,000 a year if you need long-term care. Well, a very high percentage of elderly people do, and the average length of stay is 2 years. So unless you have a dedicated long-term care insurance policy that hopefully covers whatever circumstance you find yourself in, well, where's that money coming from, right? And that doesn't even count the fact that little thing that you do now, like maybe you clean your own house now, maybe you do your own lawn care now. Are you able to do those things when you're 67 or 70? Do you need to pay the neighborhood kid to do it? And if you don't do that, do you need to move to a place where there's a higher HOA fee so that you don't have to worry about it, right? All of those things are little extra pieces that come into play. Now, I think it's a little unreasonable to sit there and try to predict exactly what all that will cost. The more practical solution is to just look at your budget now. Don't nickel and dime yourself. Don't remove every single tiny little thing that's not going to be there. Give yourself that fluff, recognizing that some new things will come into play when you're in 60s, 70s, and 80s, and give yourself a little bit of grace and a little bit of wiggle room. It is much better to be more prepared than to be underprepared. You don't even have to continue the path you're on. Like, if you invest enough, let's say, to hit that 5.5 million now, and you're consistent, and you do that all through your 30s, and you do that all through your 40s. Well, maybe in your 50s, you've had a life circumstance change. Maybe you move to a lower cost of living area, or something shifts where you genuinely go, okay, I really don't think I'm going to need that 5.5 in retirement. Do you know how easy it is to go, okay, I'm going to dial back investing a little bit. No problem. I'm going to spend a little bit more each year, right? Like, that is a non-issue. All of us can do that. So easy. What is far more difficult is to, let's say, invest enough all through your 30s and 40s to have $1 million in retirement. And then hit your 50s and go, oh crap. I need 4 to 5 times that. And now it's like mathematically impossible for me to even invest as much as I need to every single month while still like living and paying for life. And oh, by the way, now I'm older and now I have a bunch of kids in super expensive competition sports and I'm trying to help them with college, and life is not any less expensive. You have to really be intentional about starting this system now, because if you have this idea in your head of like, things are hard for me right now and they're going to get easier later, it's a lie. It's not going to get easier. Life does not get less expensive. Life does not get less busy. And so you just have to figure out a way to make it work. The only way to actually make a money system now that is reflective of genuine future success is to know this number. So if you have not done it yet, sit down, grab a piece of paper, grab a pen, and just pencil out the simple math. It might not be a laser accurate projection, but at least you will have a solid guesstimate of where you need to be. And then you can backtrack to see, is what I'm doing now creating that? Or am I one of the medical professionals that's going to have one of these multi-million-dollar gaps?